Hi, welcome to the Diablo Podcast. We are online at diablopodcast.com, and this is a service of diabloinkgamers.com. I am your host, Flux, and I am joined this week by a new guest and a first-time podcaster. This is Garwulf.
Hello.
And you were a columnist on our site. You wrote Garwulf's Corner. Well, that was, about 2000 to 2002 or so?
Yeah, it went from Halloween 2000 to, I think, around Halloween 2002. It was 52 installments.
And you also wrote the Diablo Demonsbane, and a novella that was e-published by Blizzard back in, about 2002 or so?
No, it was 2000. It was the launch of the entire Blizzard fiction line, and it was also part of the first attempt at an ebook revolution, which a lot of people, particularly technology pundits, like to sort of forget that in 2000 to 2002 there was a major push for ebooks. Which completely failed and just fell flat on its face. It was sort of like storming the ramparts and discovering that the other side hadn't noticed you were there yet.
There wasn't even a castle there yet.
No, there wasn't.
No Nooks and no Kindles and none of this stuff.
Yeah, well, there were ebook readers out there. There was the Palm Reader. I don't remember if Sony had one or not. It was sort of interesting being at a convention and going to Rob Sawyer's panel and finding myself asking him, "Hey, is that an ebook reader you've got there?" And having him just look at me and go, "Didn't you write an ebook?" I said, "Yeah, I wrote it. All I saw, I saw it on a word processor. I've never actually seen an ebook reader before." And the funny thing is, in some ways, the technology has moved forward quite a lot. But in a lot of ways, people just didn't use technology in a way that would allow for a large ebook market yet. And in some ways, the technology has not moved much at all. If I had to say what actually caused the ebook revolution to finally be able to start happening, I'd say it was cell phones and the way that changed how we use technology. But there were no shortage of people in 2000 who were saying that ebooks were going to sweep away the printed book, and within a couple of years, bookstores would be obsolete and would be an endangered species and whatnot. A lot of the technology pundits like to sort of strategically forget that they were saying that back then. What happened instead was that the ebooks just didn't move because there wasn't a market yet. Even Demonsbane, which I think was on the Peanut Press bestseller list for about 3 weeks or so. I think it got finally supplanted when the Warcraft ebook was published. It sold a few hundred copies, and that was it, which was amazing for an ebook. I was Canada's first successful ebook author, but successful in this case meant that everyone else was selling dozens of copies if they were lucky, and I was selling hundreds. If I'd been Stephen King, I might have sold thousands, but instead it did very poorly, even though it had ads on Battle.net, and they did everything they could to make this thing succeed. They really Pocketbooks really twisted itself into a pretzel. So did Blizzard. But the market just wasn't there yet. And so when Diablo Archive came out, I was thrilled. I was absolutely thrilled because it meant people would finally be able to read Demonsbane at last.
Okay, that was about my next 17 questions all in one answer, so we'll skip down a little bit.
Yeah, I'm a fan of Kevin Smith, so I'm kind of like that.
As you said with ebooks, it seems like people weren't used to reading text on a small handheld device or even a medium-sized handheld device. And now, of course, as you mentioned, we have cell phones and text messages and iPhones and other smartphones. And obviously now the iPad is even kind of moving along the same way as Kindle and Nook. And you have a new ebook coming out. We're going to get into details about that a little later on, but just that's kind of why you're on the show. You wanted to promote this, obviously. Yep. Authors want to do that kind of thing.
Yep, the Traveler on the Road of Legends.
And so give us a very brief mention of this, and we'll get back to it later on in the conversation. What is your new book, and what are you doing with it?
Well, it's actually, to a degree, an old book. It was the original draft for it was written before Demonsbane was. I think it predated Demonsbane by about 5 months, and it's an introduction to the Road of Legends universe that my other unpublished novels are set in. And a few things kept me out of print. There was a very crucial time when a lot of fantasy was bought up after The Lord of the Rings came out. And I was having agent problems at the time, and so I missed that buying spree. and unfortunately, that sort of pushed me out of the way for quite a long time. There's a couple of other things that were going on that I really can't talk about, because I do kind of want to get back into the publishers and whatnot. But back in 2007, I started my own publishing company called Legacy Books Press, and I've been publishing nonfiction history books ever since. And finally, having just been in the process of launching a Kindle line, I decided, you know what? I'd like to get some of my fiction out there. So I cleaned it up. It was very decent prose of me back in 1999, but there are some things I thought were truly terrible in 2012. And so I cleaned up the prose, made sure the dialogue worked. Then, because authors tend to be the worst editors of their own work, I passed it over to my fiancée, who was kind enough to take a look at it, found a point that didn't work. And then I put that up under Legacy Books Press fiction, and that's how that ended up going up. But the idea behind The Road of Legends is very much influenced by Michael Moorcock. And I was reading Michael Moorcock when I was a teenager. And Moorcock did not content himself with creating a world. He created a universe. He created the multiverse. And having started off with things like Dennis McKiernan, who inspired me to write, and who I was blessed enough to be able to actually work with on Demonsbane, Dennis edited a draft of it. And having read Tolkien and Tad Williams, to suddenly have this massive scope where you'd have Moorcock's characters be these Victorian explorers wandering from world to world, it just grabbed me, and it made me realize I didn't have to content myself with creating a world. I could create an entire universe of my own. And so the Road of Legends, the Great Road, is this place where, if you believe in it, you can walk to anything you can imagine. Any myth you can go and visit, any legend, any fantasy world, you can just walk there. Which leads to some interesting questions as the characters who are doing this sort of have to figure out whether or not they themselves are imaginary. So get to play a bit with the entire am I real thing. But it's really the introduction to this universe. Somebody is wiping out myths. Essentially, if you have a dragon fight, they bring a rocket launcher and wipe out both sides. And the main characters have to figure out who's doing this, why they're doing it, and how to stop them.
How do you wipe out a myth if it exists, if people believe in it? It doesn't change what people believe in. They just stop believing in what they used to believe in because it no longer exists?
Well, it's an interesting question. I hope I explain it well in the book. But basically, it really has to do with how myths are started. The opening scene is at the Battle of Malden, which is a very famous, depending on which circles you're in. It's a sort of a famous defeat poem. It's kind of like the Anglo-Saxons screaming out, "Yay, the Vikings kicked our asses, but we died gloriously." But how did we get that poem? We got that poem because the survivors wrote it down. They mythologized it. And if you walk into this myth and you wipe out all the survivors, no one's left to mythologize it. And so you're sort of erasing it from history.
Mm-hmm. That assumes that the myths have a basis in reality that can be affected, though.
Yep.
Which is interesting. Getting a little meta on the whole concept.
Oh yeah, it's a tremendous amount of fun. One of the things about dealing with something like, say, Demonsbane, or with any licensed work, is that you are bound by someone else's creation. One of the things I was told was that when I wrote Demonsbane, I was to leave the world of Sanctuary in more or less the same shape that I found it. So I couldn't, say, go and nuke Kyrgyzstan or something like that. And with the Road of Legends, though, I can do whatever I want. It's my universe. And I like to have this sort of fun. So to a degree, it's what happens when I'm unleashed. Yeah.
So to continue jumping from topic to topic, a little bit about Garwulf's Corner. You wrote that on the site, and I've resuscitated most of the old columns.
And thank you very much.
In our new news script. They didn't all get translated over at all, so we had to redo things, and you've also been posting those on your own site. And you got, I believe you wrote 52 columns.
Yes.
And I believe you were the most temporally perfect of all the columnists. I don't think you missed an every other week deadline for 2 years while you were running.
Yeah, well, one of the ways that I knew that it was time to end it was that I was starting to finish the columns shortly before they were going to go up, and that's how I knew I was starting to run out of things to say. But one of the secrets to all of that was that the columns were frequently written about 2 installments or so in advance, or at least 2 or 3 weeks in advance. So if column number 17 went up, column number 18 was written, and column number 19 probably existed in some sort of draft. This occasionally bit me in the hindquarters. I remember this one time where there was an uprising in Palestine that had just begun on the news. And I made this comparison of, I think it was hackers or some sort. You know, I said that they were as vicious in their own way as a Palestinian bomber. Well, between my writing that statement and the thing being published, it turned into, I think it was called the Second Intifada or something like that. It turned into a full-on uprising. It was a very complicated situation. I certainly did not do justice to it at all. And, ooh, did people get annoyed. I ended up having to swallow my pride and apologize for that one right in the column. But it was one of those things where occasionally something happens that can knock you out of date in as little as 2 weeks. And when you're writing columns 4 weeks in advance, this can be an occasional problem. It didn't happen often, but it did happen. But the time did come towards the end where it was getting harder and harder to figure out what to say. And there's only so many things you can use Diablo as a jumping off point for. I think by the end, the column was only marginally about Diablo. It was, and to this day, though, I kind of wish I hadn't run out of ideas. I would love to have kept going with it.
And I was going to say, what was the column about to some extent? You weren't writing, strategy guides for paladins or anything. It was sort of a little bit of, nor were you writing about Middle Eastern conflicts very often as well. That just sort of was an analogy you happened to have in one column. But
yeah. It
was more about fantasy in general and RPGs, and you were, as you kind of mentioned here, you're interested in history, and I believe you were some sort of medieval studies. You were an expert on armors and swords and such from the old days.
I'm a sword collector. I'm very knowledgeable when it comes to swords. I think there are people who are far more knowledgeable. I'm nowhere to Oakshot. But
he's not here today, so you'll have to do.
Yeah, and sadly he has passed. But he was part of the movement to get medieval swords away from this is a sharpened crowbar to this is a precision weapon. But Garwulf's Corner was, I think, the first computer games issues column in the English language on the internet, or at least it was one of them. And one of the things that actually brought me into writing it was that I would go to this place in Kingston called Digital Gamer, which was run by this really great guy named Malcolm Cox. And it was sort of like, it was a gaming bar of sorts. You'd go in, you'd pay $5 per half hour, and you'd play network games. But it was basically a place where you could have LAN party after LAN party after LAN party. And on this coffee table, he had Computer Gaming World and PC Gamer, and I'd read these things. And back in 2000, the computer game media had, I think, 3 types of articles, and that was it. They had previews, they had reviews, and they had strategy guides. Occasionally an editorial managed to sneak in, but for all intents and purposes, these games were being treated as toys. In fact, the big controversy, the overarching controversy, if you want to put it that way, that I think, well, at least I recall, came out while I was doing Garwulf's Corner wasn't games as art. We weren't even close to the idea of games as art. I don't think I ever even mentioned games as art. It was games being capable of communicating ideas. Convincing people that this was the case was an uphill struggle in 2000 and 2001. And Garwulf's Corner basically was sitting there going, I was sitting there thinking, you know what? These games have issues that are worth talking about. You have occasionally sexism showing up, and that's worthy of discussion.
Occasionally.
Yeah, occasionally, yeah, quote unquote.
Very little of that in games.
Yeah,
it's entirely equal in the treatment of the genders.
Yeah, but interestingly enough, though, when I raised in Garwulf's Corner, there was no nerd rage. It was, one of the things about being the path less traveled at that time was that the idiots had not yet jumped on board, and so it was possible to have a very intelligent discussion. But I found out a bit later that someone had in fact been writing about computer games issues in Russian, and they'd beaten me to it by about 3 or 4 months. But the only other column out there at the time was Jessica Mulligan's Biting the Hand, and it was an Industry Insider column, and I only found out it even existed months into Garwulf's Corner running. It really felt like being the voice in the wilderness, just calling out and saying, you know what, let's talk about the issues with hackers. Let's talk about how we actually play games. Are we playing them because we enjoy them, or are we playing them because we're in the habit of playing them? And that was, I think, installment number 6. Was, I think, the first real serious issues installment. And it got, I think the last fan mail I received about it was about 3 or 4 years ago. I mean, the fan mail for that went 6-7 years after the column finished up, or maybe after the column ran. My math may be marginally off there, but nobody was writing nobody was writing about this stuff. And I think what happened was that the people who were my age, because I was, I think, 23, 24. I was born in 76. I'm 35 years old now. And people like me who had played computer games, had grown up playing computer games, had grown up seeing them not as toys but as entertainment. And so therefore, that these things could communicate ideas we took it for granted. And when you come into your 20s, that's when you start to actually write. That's when you start to come into your own. That's when you start to get published. And I may have been the first one out there, but by about a year in, people were starting to do what I was doing. And I still remember being absolutely thrilled when Apolitan, which was a Civilization fan site, published a rebuttal to one of my installments. I think the installment was called Copy of a Copy. And they disagreed with me. They put it out as an editorial, and I couldn't have been more thrilled. Because when I was writing Garwulf's Corner, I was writing it, I'd been inspired to write it by a column called An Edge in My Voice by Harlan Ellison. And Ellison's philosophy was that he was not necessarily writing to be right, although that helped. He was writing to raise the question. And so anytime someone said, you know what, I understand where you're coming from, but I got to disagree with you on this, I think the issue is actually X, Y, and Z, it meant I'd succeeded. It meant a conversation had started. That's one of the reasons why every 7 installments there was a feedback column, and they were my favorite columns to work on, particularly when enough people disagreed with me that I could actually put it together and show people this is the discussion that's happening. And really, the difference between what I was doing, what Garwulf's Corner was doing, what Diablo2.net was doing with it, and what Computer Gaming World was doing, for example, was really brought home. And I mentioned this in a column. This is how I remember it, because I was rereading these recently. But when I took a look at Computer Gaming World just to see what sort of feedback they were getting, and the letters to the editor that they were publishing, and this was what they published. They may very well have been getting letters like I was getting. But what they were publishing was stuff like, well, I think this game's coming out is going to be really cool. Or, I think this review you wrote was completely wrong. And around the same time, I was getting stuff like letters that were ruminating on the nature of evil. And I remember one of my favorite letters was from the Sentience Research Division of the Department of Defense, where this guy talked about, after I wrote a column called Shades of Grey, this guy wrote in saying, look, this is basically our lunch table conversation, and here are the problems we're having in teaching a battlefield artificial intelligence empathy. And this was the stuff that I was getting, and it was just absolutely thrilling to be able to have this discussion. And when Garwulf's Corner finished, lots of people were doing it. But when it started, no one was doing it. It really was, I don't know if Garwulf's Corner inspired everybody else. I have a feeling it didn't. I think most of it was just people like me picking up their pens and finding a place for their voice to be heard. But it was absolutely thrilling to be on the vanguard of that. It really was.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that I remember from that is that we didn't. You and the other columnists we had would send me emails, and I would format those and post them on the website, and there were no direct comments on them. We actually got email feedback. I mean,
yeah.
I remember I was doing columns around the same time as you, and mine were all about the game. I mean, Flux's Decahedron I was doing, and it was my top 10 best uniques or worst quests, or mostly comical stuff. And I would get hundreds of emails on some of them with people, arguing about if they like the items or not. But you don't get any emails on anything anymore. I mean, very few. I mean, running the website, I get, a few a day. We get news submission stuff. But everything is done in comments. Everything is done in Twitter. Everything is done immediately on the site. Or everybody reading it has their own blog, and they go write about what you said on their blog. So it's an interesting how we used to be, it was much more of a sort of a simulation of the print industry back in those days, where you would present content. We didn't even have comments on main page news posts in those days.
Yeah,
and now everybody's got a blog.
Yeah,
so,
and you have to
including you.
Well, and the thing is, it's just the way people engage with material. This is why I find people talking about ebooks sometimes to be so very, very annoying, because one of the things that I really have it in for technology pundits, because they like to take this stance that the fact that a technology is new means that it must be better. Whereas people don't look at how the technology is used. Newsprint is an endangered species if you don't have these forums. Just because this is the way people engage in this sort of news in a very active way. They like to discuss it as a group. And when Garwulf's Corner was running and Flux's Decahedron was running, we hadn't quite bridged that gap yet. We were still working on a print model, and people were used to letters to the editor. Today, I don't think if Garwulf's Corner, Garwulf's Corner was brand new and running today, I think it would be all comments. I don't think I would have received a single email. I have to say, I think I preferred the email. It was definitely a more personal experience. But you received hundreds of emails per installment. I received dozens.
Well, I was doing a more immediate, here's why these items are good, and making obnoxious jokes about necromancers.
Yeah.
So I think I was doing a little more rabble-rousing, quite intentionally at the time, in my heady youth.
Yeah, well,
I'm much more settled now and never try to just piss people off with bad jokes. Oh, wait.
Well, you're talking to the man who propositioned the entire city of Toronto to try to make a point, and then found that everyone got it, so no one was offended, and I couldn't explain it to anybody. Actually having a feedback installment where you ask the question, what does it take to offend you people? Was an interesting thing. And by the way, trivia for you readers, when I'm talking about the evil editor in my columns, Flux here was the editor for Garwulf's Corner, and he very kindly allowed me to use him as a prop very, very often. He never really did threaten to do terrible things to me with toothpicks or anything like that. He didn't.
You were very far away geographically, so that would have been tough. It's funny, we never talked before this. We traded lots of emails over time, but we didn't have Skype back then. That's showing how much technology has changed.
Yeah, and it is an interesting new world, and it's interesting just how much has changed and how much hasn't. And some of the computer games issues today, they just break my heart. They really do. I love the entire games as art controversy. I think that's an amazing controversy. I absolutely love it. There's so much depth to it. But at the same time, I like to call the age of Diablo and Neverwinter Nights and Diablo II and the golden age of computer games. Because it was wild creativity. It really was. And today, so many game developers have jumped ship to the consoles that it used to be that you could count on 15 new releases a year, easy. And now you're lucky if you get 5 major releases a year, and most of them, I hate to say it, most of them just elicit a well, been there, done that reaction from me. I mean, I played Medal of Honor Allied Assault. How many times do you really need to storm the beaches of Normandy? But some of the issues, digital rights management, piracy, they destroyed the gaming that I know and love. I understand why Blizzard did the client-server model for Diablo III. And the thing that breaks my heart about that is that they avoided, at almost all costs, they twisted themselves into a pretzel to avoid saying we're doing this as an anti-piracy measure. And the thing is, it doesn't make sense as anything other than an anti-piracy measure in a lot of ways. Because they're basically running it as a massively multiplayer game, without the monthly revenues of a massively multiplayer game. Now, one friend pointed out that they do have the auction houses and whatnot, but I think the biggest, there's an old saying about the devil's greatest achievement was convincing the world they didn't exist. I think the computer game pirates' greatest publicity coup was convincing everybody that their victims were the problem. And so you have this arms race that's been going on. And I think a website called Tweet Guides actually ran the numbers, and they found that the piracy rate, once a game is cracked for a PC game release, was something like 12 pirated copies being downloaded for every single legitimate copy downloaded or sold. Whereas in the console, it was, I think, 6 legit for every pirated one. And this is, and the world of computer gaming today, I think, has become a bleaker place as a result. I loved the days when game companies would say, you know what, we've never tried to combine a flight simulator with a real-time strategy game. Let's see if that works and make it a AAA release. And they did that 10 years ago. They don't do it now. That's a sad thing.
Well, definitely games have become more mass market, and you have to budget, and the games were more of a geeky sort of thing 10, 12 years ago, especially RPGs, and I mean, before Lord of the Rings, fantasy was really quite ghettoized. You mentioned the buying of fiction.
Yep.
Now you look at like the biggest movie properties are Harry Potter and Twilight and stuff, or fantasy, or not high fantasy so much. Of course, Lord of the Rings was quite popular as well.
Yep.
But a lot of the complaints and debate about Diablo III during development was that they were sort of accessibility was the big key word, and there were lots of game systems that were more complicated or would require a little more of a learning curve, and pretty much all those got jettisoned. And so it was like, well, if you have to think about something or know what you're doing, there's no automatic stat points, no skill points, all this kind of stuff. We had 3 or 4 years of debate on these issues, but Blizzard especially, obviously Diablo III was just the biggest selling PC game in history. So certainly accessibility is a success in some ways, but we're seeing a lot of arguments about if the game has the depth and the longevity that Diablo II did.
Well, it'll be interesting to see, because one of the things about Diablo 2 was that they didn't need to use a client-server model for that. So I can put Diablo 2 into my computer and play it today, even if Blizzard had, for some bizarre reason, just collapsed. If World of Warcraft somehow failed and took them down with it, I'd still be able to play Diablo 2. The same,
but of course, if you go on Battle.net, every person in the game will be a bot or a hack or using duped items. So there are trade-offs.
Oh yeah. But
and I'm sure someone will post a comment saying client server doesn't protect against that. That's because they had bad tech, and you shouldn't blame the technology for the actions of the users, etc. But there's obviously a pretty strong correlation between these things.
Well, absolutely, I agree. The correlation is there, and I just wish it wasn't necessary. I mean, as an anti-piracy measure, it works beautifully. You can't pirate Diablo 3 unless you build Diablo 3. But it's one of the reasons. That's one of the reasons why, when the time came, I looked at Diablo 3 and said, you know what, this isn't the gaming world I wanted to be a part of, and I passed on this one. But going back to the earlier issue of accessibility, even back in Garwulf's Corner days, I think there was an argument about, do you go for complexity do you go for ease of use? And I think the thing that Blizzard picked up on, which made them so very successful, is that the easier the game is to play, the more fun you can have, and the complexity involved. There's plenty of ways to have complexity. Making it hard to use the game is not the way you want to go. But you look at, say, Diablo 1, and even I think to a degree Diablo 2, you could play with a single button mouse. You didn't even need a keyboard.
Good thing for Mac fans.
Yeah, well, yeah, Mac and their one-eyed mice. Poor things must have had absolutely no depth perception, but that's something that Blizzard does very well. Is they do simplicity. And they understand that the greatest simplicity also comes very frequently the greatest elegance. And if you've got a game that's very easy to play, you can put in all the stuff that makes the experience richer, without having that richness, I guess, stem from how many keys do you have to press in order to do it. I think that's a coaching point.
Well, that's one of the things Blizzard always says, a minute to learn, a lifetime to master is sort of the cliche.
Yep.
And we're still working on the mastery for Diablo III, but this is where you get burned in effigy by listeners, although perhaps not, given some recent twists, but you have not played Diablo III at all.
I have friends who have played it. I have not played it. I did keep track. Well, I did watch its development a fair bit, and I knew it was coming when Demonsbane was written.
Save that topic for a minute. We'll get into that.
No, I mean, I played Diablo quite a lot. I met one of my best friends in Richmond Hill playing Diablo, a fellow named Gord Brown. He is Sarnical,
which was the mage character in Demonsbane.
Yep. I made him a very important person in Sanctuary history. Although, funnily enough, Sarnical the wizard did not bear that much of resemblance personality-wise to Gord Brown, but it was his character, and he and I were this Diablo team. We were very, very good. We were very, very good. We were very coordinated. We had a great deal of fun. We played Diablo 2 into the ground. But a couple of things happened. One thing was that, well, as I said, I'm 35 years old now. I'm getting married in about 11 months or so. I'm getting married next May. I run a small business. I've done national defense research. I've gotten a couple of new university degrees. A lot of I've reached the point where for a lot of games, just time-wise, they're wasted on me. Or I should say, or maybe they're wasted on me because I end up having about 8 hours to play them, and then that would be it. It would be done. The stuff I'm doing right now is stuff like training in German longsword, and learning to play the violin very, very badly, and making honey wine and stuff. And so real life got very, very full. But another thing was, as I said, I guess there's a great quote by Ronald Reagan about how he didn't leave the Democrats left him. To a degree I left computer gaming, but to a degree also computer gaming left me. This is not the gaming that I grew up playing. This is not the type of computer game world that I grew up in and that I came up in. And there comes a point when you look at it and you say, you know what, this is not the way I want to play. I don't want to have to be connected to a server to play a single player game and that stuff. And when you don't have the time to do it anyway, you just sort of end up walking away. That said, if Blizzard ever did come back and knock at my door, or Blizzard and Pocket ever knocked at my door and said, hey, we would like you to write another Diablo novel, I wouldn't even have to think about it. It would be, yes, like that. Because it was just so much fun the first time around. It really was. I would love to do it again.
well, I'll take that as a useful segue and go into Demonsbane stuff a little bit. You mentioned, I was reading, we have an old interview from you, a text interview I did with you around the time of Demonsbane. I guess it was before Garwulf's Corner existed, or right around that time.
Mm-hmm.
And you talked about how you had, why don't you just run through that briefly, how you got to be writing this book. You said you sent them letters through your publisher and basically said, hey, I want to do this, and they said, sure. They being Blizzard.
Yeah, well, it's a bit more interesting than that. I think I got the Demonsbane contract because I had balls of steel. What happened was I had been trying to break into being a professional writer properly, getting that first book contract for a couple of years, and I'd written this novel called Demon's Vengeance when I was a teenager. It was 60,000 words, absolutely embarrassing today. And I'd written another novel called Magus Draconum, not so embarrassing. I was older, I knew a lot more about the world and whatnot, but I hadn't had any luck in the numbers game yet. And when I decided to go pro, I think around 98, I stopped writing fan fiction. I had been writing Doctor Who fanfic. I'd written some Highlander fanfic. But there was this one little thing that actually got me into writing fan fiction again, very briefly. And there was this little dungeon romp called Diablo. You may have heard of it. And I wrote this little story. I think it was called Hell's Negotiators or something like that, and it was and I used Diablo fanfic to be a bit experimental. There was this one which was a comedy, which was basically Diablo and the dungeon under the Tristram Cathedral having a business meeting, and Diablo is this sort of henpecked boss who's dealing with these truly bizarre people. The Skeleton King has a drinking problem and stuff like that, I don't know if the Skeleton King ever actually did finish dealing with his drinking problem. I know that he was costing the dungeon quite a lot in booze, though. And then you had this H.P. Lovecraft pastiche, and it was the first pastiche I ever wrote, which was set quite a long time after all the events in Diablo, and it was just these archaeologists finding out that the evil under Tristram isn't quite dead yet. And I found out on one of the forums that Blizzard and that Blizzard was going to be doing a bunch of Diablo novels. And I thought to myself, here's my chance. So I call up Blizzard. Blizzard directs me to Pocket Books. Pocket Books directs me to Marco Palmieri, who was the editor at the time. And I called up Marco, and I introduced myself. I said, look, I've been trying to break into professional fiction. I've won a couple of fan fiction awards, which is quite true. I had, in fact, won, I think, 2 fan fiction awards by then. And I think the first words out, and I basically said to him, I heard that you've got a Diablo novel series that you're going to be editing, and I've got a book I'd like to pitch. And I think his reply was, how did you get this number? But we talked about it for a bit, and he told me that, well, look, yes, we are doing it. All of them are signed, though. But why don't you send me some of your writing? So I sent him these 2 stories. One was called A Kingdom for a Sword, and it started life as a Diablo fanfiction, and then later morphed into a Road of Legends story. And it was a bit along the lines of Diablo. It had a romp into the dungeon and stuff like that. The ending, to this day, I'm embarrassed by. I'm fairly convinced Marco didn't actually read to the very end. I might not have gotten the contract if he had. The other was called One Final Game, I believe. And it was a story about an old chess master playing a game of chess against death. And every time he moves a piece, you get a flashback to part of his life. And funnily enough, that too had started out as a fanfic, although that was a Doctor Who fanfic, and it was the very last Doctor, playing his last game of chess, and you'd flash back to each generation. When it was turned into an original story, frankly, I think it was a lot better. So you see this guy you saw this guy go through his life, starting off as a Jew in hiding in the Holocaust, and moving to Canada and becoming a chess master until he finally dies of old age. And the big revelation at the end is that he just wanted to play one last game. He wanted to lose in a specific way.
He wasn't playing with death to win a new life.
He wasn't.
No, because death always falls for the castle trap if you try that one.
Yeah. Well, I think this guy knew that.
He overcommits his bishops as well.
Yep.
So you sent the publisher some sample books, and he said, "Hey, these aren't bad. You want to write a novella?"
Well, what happened was between my sending this material and Marco reading it, there was a lot of talk about ebooks being the next big thing, and a lot of big publishers. The big publishers had two reactions. Some of them said, "All right, let's wait and see what the others do, and see if this actually flies." And Pocket Books was one of the publishers that said, "All right, let's try this out." And they did a great deal of thought, and they figured out what exactly would be the ideal length and whatnot. And Marco read my material, and since this is an ebook, so they're not going to be committing tens of thousands of dollars into it. They were committing thousands of dollars, but not, the $10,000 or $20,000 they'd need to launch a mass market paperback with 20,000 copies printed and whatnot. They said, "All right, you know what? Let's give this kid a chance." So I received a call from Pocketbook saying, we liked your stuff. We're doing an ebook line. And would you be interested in writing the Diablo ebook? And I, of course, considered very carefully and quickly said, yes, 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 please, before they could change their mind. And furthermore discovered that the ebook was going to be coming out in October before the others. So it was basically launching the entire Blizzard fiction line, which led to the interesting question of just, how do you set the scene for the other books, particularly when you don't know what's in the manuscripts,
So what was the date at this point? You had how many months to work on this?
I think this was about April.
So we're doing this in 6 months or 5 months, and get ready.
Yeah, when pen actually went to paper, Demonsbane was written in about 3 weeks flat. It was some very intensive writing, but there was a long process before that where the story was hammered out. What happened was I was told that I needed to come up with 3 or 4 story ideas. And the one that I'd originally planned to pitch to them, funnily enough, was a novelization of Diablo I, and what I was thinking was that as a straight up and down dungeon romp, it would not work as a book, just be too much of the same. But if they put the crypt in Tristram, and you put the catacombs in another town, say Brenner, and you put the caves around Tristram, bouncing back and forth, and it becomes an overland quest, and you can add a lot of extra complexity. That's what I was going to be pitching, but with a 20 to 30,000 word count, there just wasn't the space to do that. And so I had to come up with a number of ideas. Some of them, some of the ideas there was. One of them that I was actually a bit disappointed that I couldn't use was the story of Arcane, because I wanted to tell the story of how Arcane's Valor got into the dungeon in the first place. And it would involve him dying valiantly at the siege of Kyrgyzstan when they fend back the demons. Another was, and this one actually wasn't in the original pitched ideas, it was something I came up with between sending the ideas in and actually having the story discussion with Marco and Chris Metzen at Blizzard. This was after I'd pitched this was after I'd come up with a number of story ideas, and the idea with Sigurd was actually one of the ones that was towards the end of the list. I was actually a bit more fond of the Arcane. I also came up with this idea of a novella which was sort of a rendition of Beowulf, a bit through the lens of the 13th Warrior, where you have this paladin going up into the barbarian lands to try to get their support in the war against Diablo, and he has to prove himself by helping them fight off a monster in a great hall. and whatnot. And this ended up actually being, I liked this idea a lot, and Blizzard said, you know what, that's a really cool idea, but the entire expansion is taking place in that particular area, and we really can only have one team working on the barbarian culture. Because if we end up contradicting stuff, it's going to be a problem. It's just simpler to have, the expansion team working on it. And so me and my precious Vikings ended up in Ensteak. But
as best I recall of the first 3 Diablo novels, none of them were really tied to the plots of the books. They were almost like add-ons, and that's kind of what Demonsbane was as well. It was sort of a warrior-esque character and a sorcerer-esque character from Diablo 1, Ton of Archetypes, fighting some demons who weren't related to the main plot line. It didn't seem like Blizzard really knew how they wanted to integrate their additional novels into their main storylines and thrust at that point.
Well, what they were trying to do was expand the universe, basically. And what they'd done was, right at the beginning of this process, they'd faxed me the Diablo Bible. And what I mean by this is, it was the behind-the-scenes writer's guide, saying, this is the history of the Diablo world, here's how the magic works, here's the history from start to finish, here's the Dark Exile, here's the Sin War, etc., etc. And they told me to go through it and see what grabbed me.
And how did that compare to what was in like the Diablo 1 manual itself? Just more fleshed out?
It was much more fleshed out. A surprising amount actually was duplicated. The tomes of lore in Diablo 1, revealed a lot of the stuff that was in the Writer's Bible, but there was a lot more that was fleshed out. And I think I can talk about this now because Diablo 3 is out, the secret is out, and the storyline is out. But there was this section for, you had the Dark Exile, and then you had Diablo 1, Diablo 2, Diablo 2 expansion from, this plot line from start to finish. And then there was Diablo 3. Or it was labeled after or something like that.
And this was back in 2000, so it was obviously the first version of Diablo 3, which we've never seen publicly.
Well, I can't speak to that. I know that they had, from what I've read of Diablo 3 and the story behind it, it matches up with the Writer's Bible pretty closely. And there was this warning saying, here's the story for Diablo 3. If at all possible, don't touch it, don't reference it, and if you have to talk about it in any way, make it some sort of really vague prophecy that could mean anything. They did want to keep a lid on it, but this was why, for example, when Richard Knack was pounding out Diablo novels, he once said in an interview, "I'm not writing for a dead game." And in fact, funnily enough, there was a point a few years back where Blizzard advertised for some computer game developers, and they were looking for 3D modelers and whatnot, and all the word was that it would be a massively multiplayer game. And because of the way that the Writer's Bible was written, I sort of looked at that and went, this is Diablo 3. It wasn't. It was World of Warcraft, in fact, but the story for Diablo 3 actually does tend to would have worked as a massively multiplayer game.
That was the initial plan, by the way. I talked to Max Schaefer about that last year on this podcast, and I believe that was the first time they had ever mentioned it, that when he was working on Diablo 3, he left there with the whole breakup of Blizzard North in mid-2003. All their initial plans were for an MMO with lots of instancing instead of big town hubs and such. But that was well before, from what Max said, that was all just sort of in the Irish countryside, I think is how he termed it, for the setting, which is very different from what we saw when there were some leaked screenshots of Diablo 3 a few years ago from the early version, and they were all set in heaven, which we obviously see in Diablo 3. Not that you would know that because you don't play it anymore because you're a bad person and don't like video games.
Oh, I'm a terribly evil person, yes. My fiancée keeps telling me that.
Well, she would be the one who would know best, I suppose.
She would. Actually, I knew that the stuff would be in heaven. That was in the Writer's Bible. But I remember the screenshots quite well, and I remember the hubbub over the screenshots because they were colorful. And you could actually see what the monsters were, and that they were different from your character. And I remember when Gordon and I discovered necromancers in Diablo 2, and we played a pair of necromancers. And we discovered that, in fact, it is very difficult to tell who you're supposed to be shooting at when you've got two necromancers, each with about 8 or so skeletons, fighting a bunch of skeletons in a dungeon. And so when Blizzard came out and explained that, yes, we do need to separate the player from the monsters and their stuff, I understood completely what they were talking about. I'd been there, I'd done that, I'd gotten the T-shirt. It was funny, though, we'd show up on the scene, the skeletons would clear stuff out, we'd move on. Worked beautifully for the first few levels. Didn't work so well for the once we got out of the first act, though. But
well, then you had to start getting 25 revives each, which were the giant blackish purple monsters that completely filled the entire screen with their visuals. Yeah, there were some issues with pets and other visuals in Diablo 2. We always had this debate about rose-tinted glasses and people remembering everything being wonderful and perfect in Diablo 2. And oddly enough, no other game can match up to that because it was wonderful and perfect. So I have to agree with you on that point, at least, that they did a lot. 8 players all casting big, flashy, colorful spells with lots of minions was complete and total chaos on the same screen, and you really couldn't tell what you were doing.
Yep. Well, we tend to look at this stuff through rose-colored goggles. I mean, you look at, say, I think if you look back at what I call the golden age of computer gaming, and you actually looked at the games themselves, you find most of them were crap. And a lot of them were experimental, but didn't necessarily work very well. But I think we remember Diablo and Diablo 2 very fondly, because Blizzard got it right. There was stuff that they could have done better. But the stuff that they did well, they did really well, and it was the important stuff. It opened the door so that you could really have fun with it. And the problem then becomes what happens when you get multiplayer and a bunch of people who will lie, cheat, and steal to get that ultimate armor, and who have absolutely no qualms about hacking the game. And that becomes a bit of an arms race, and you get the realms and whatnot. But what they did with that, they became classic computer games, not because they were incredibly complicated in plot. In fact, but they weren't actually simple either. If you actually look at the plot of Diablo 1, it looks like, on the surface, it's a straight-up dungeon crawl. But stuff is going on. It's there. All you have to do is pay attention to it. There's a very rich world behind it. And the underlying theme is that when you stare at the abyss stares back into you. And you see is your character being corrupted and slamming a giant, jagged crystal into his skull. With, hopefully that's not a spoiler for anybody at this point. But that stuff was there. So it wasn't just that it was a fun dungeon romp. There was actually stuff under the surface. And that...
I think that's our first Nietzsche quote on the podcast, so congrats for that.
Hey.
So, jumping to your current project, we're about out of time here on the podcast. Not that there's a time limit, but we try to aim for about 50 minutes or so. You've got this new book, you mentioned it earlier. It's an original world creation of your own. It's an ebook, and it's available right now.
Yes, it is. It's on Amazon.com, and it's available for the Kindle.
And it's called The Traveler on the Road of Legends. And it's... how long?
It's a bit shorter than Demonsbane. Demonsbane was about 25,000 words. Traveler on the Road of Legends is 18,000 words. So it's a novella.
And you're envisioning this as sort of an introduction to this world you'd like to create more literary efforts in?
Well, I'd like to see more literary efforts see the light of day. One of the things I'm hoping is that lots of people will buy this, and then that will make it more attractive for the publishers to finally move on it. There are 2 full-length completed Road of Legends novels sitting on my computer right now. One is called Magus Draconum, the other is called War of Succession. And these are, as I said, they're full-length novels. They're 100,000 words plus. And you get to see the life story, and in one you get to see the life story of Delgar Dragon Mage, who is a major character in Traveler on the Road of Legends. And in another one, you get to see what happens when a bunch of wizards fighting a battle for succession co-opt entire countries and turn it into a world war. as I said, what I'm hoping is that sales for Traveler on the Road of Legends will make it a lot easier to get these other books into print so that people can read them. There are other books coming. So this is a world and a universe, in fact, that I'm hoping people will read about and like a great deal.
And it's your own original work. It's not fan fiction or it's not based on anything else. Obviously, we all have influences, but as you said earlier, it's if myths were real and they can sort of travel on this road.
Yep.
And visit various myths and times and places.
Absolutely. I mean, you can on the the Road of Legends is also called the Great Road, and you can travel anywhere you want there. You can travel into a world that has far future technology. You can travel into the distant past. You can go to Ireland, visit the Tuatha De Danann. You can see Beowulf fight the dragon. And in the case of Traveler on the Road of Legends, occasionally you have to dodge guys with rocket launchers. But, there are minor technicality and rockets do, and I guess rockets can travel sometimes low enough to duck if you're fast enough.
There's no phone booths involved in the traveling, though. I can see a little of your Doctor Who.
Oh, absolutely. I don't hide my influences at all. The funny thing is that while there's a bit of Doctor Who in there, I think there's a lot more Michael Moorcock. And I was very much thinking of his Eternal Champion series when I was putting this together, and just what he had accomplished with the Eternal Champion, where you have all of these worlds that the characters can hop along in between, and it was like being exposed to infinite imagination. It really was. And I'm kind of hoping that I've been able to accomplish something at least similar. I don't know if I'd ever be able to quite achieve what Moorcock achieved, but just to have people look at it and to read it and just be thinking about it and going, you know what, this is cool.
And you're into the world building. You said that your publishing company handles historical novels, or not novels, but books on history.
Yep.
And I'd assume you're knowledgeable about, you've done medieval studies and accuracy for weapons and armor.
Yep.
So you're you're into the world building and here's legends. You seem pretty knowledgeable about history and culture and human anthropological pursuits. So you probably try to tie all that into your book and make it a bigger. Readers are entering a whole world. It's not just a few characters doing some little minor thing.
Oh yeah, no, they're entering a whole world. They're going to get to see some places that you don't tend to necessarily see represented very often. Beowulf and the dragon do show up, although not necessarily in the way that you might expect. You get to see the Battle of Malden. I don't think a lot of people necessarily know about that. They do know about Beowulf, though. And you get to see the Tuatha De Danann, and there are a few other things. I don't want to spoil too much of it, but the bad guy has some interesting links to certain parts of our history, and I think there's no small measure of Descartes with I think therefore I am. That's peeking through the mists as well, because the interesting thing is if you can walk into worlds, and anything you can imagine is there, then does that make you imaginary too? And this is something that they do have to wrestle with.
Well, thanks for your time, Garwulf, which is your actual name.
Well, my actual name is Robert Marks.
So if you want to look for books by Robert Marks, not Garwulf, which would probably be easier to find on your Amazon.com. And congratulations on being one of the few longtime hardcore Diablo II fans who rejected Diablo III before actually playing it. Most people needed to play it for a few weeks before they decided they didn't like it, and you were ahead of the curve on that, so congrats.
Thanks, I think.
And if you're somehow listening to this on iTunes or something else, check DiabloPodcast.com, and you can see the news post with links to Miss Senior Garwulf's site and options to buy his book.
It's garwulf.livejournal.com, and my publishing company is called Legacy Books Press, which is www.legacybookspress.com. And among other things, I publish The Secret History of Star Wars by Michael Kaminsky, which actually managed to, well, let me put it to you this way. When Lucas put out his letter to the guys who did Lost, saying that, yes, actually, I did in fact make up Star Wars as I went along, Michael Kaminsky had figured that out years before. And I published the book wherein that's revealed. I've published The War That Changed the World by John Allen Price, which is about the Franco-Prussian War. And I've got an upcoming book coming out by Keld Gulster called Crucial Coalition, which is about the coalition warfare in Afghanistan and the lessons of history.
Well, anyone who enrages George Lucas is a friend of mine, so good job with that. And thanks for your time, and you're listening to the Diablo Podcast. We are online at diablopodcast.com. Bye-bye.
And thank you for having me.